Hello, everyone. My name is Ian. I'm submission number 6550, and I'm here to present the work Balancing the Trade-off Between Data Center Development and Its Environmental Impacts, which is a comparative analysis of the policymaking of data centers in two cases, Singapore and in Amsterdam. This work will be presented for the Data for Policy Conference 2022, and this research has been co-authored with Masaru Yarime and with Madalena Klim. Now we go to the introduction. So what's this research about? It's a study about the data center policymaking in two places, in Amsterdam and in Singapore. And interestingly, those two places were global hubs of data center attraction. So they were global references. And what we see is that although they were former global hubs, they issued a moratorium for new data centers. And this means that they temporarily halted the construction of new data centers. Both did in the same year, so 2019. And the moratorium was only lifted recently in both cases, as we will analyze further. And it's quite interesting, the moratoriums in terms of policy making, because they were a sudden reversal of the prevailing policy paradigm. So before moratorium, they always wanted to attract new data centers. And what we see is that moratorium, they just cancel and they said, we do not like more data centers, at least while the moratorium was enacted. And both places actually issued the same reason officially, at least, for the decision of the moratorium. And the issue is that they needed the moratorium to readjust the permits and to manage essentially the negative environmental impacts that was being observed with the growth of digital infrastructure. In simpler terms, the more data centers, the more they were causing environmental impacts. And those environmental impacts were becoming unsustainable, at least for them. So they'd like to halt temporarily with a moratorium. And first, let's go to the general theoretical discussion about this topic. So it inserts in what we call the environmental impact of digital infrastructure discussion, which essentially you have two main study types. The first study type, which is, let's say, the first group of studies, says that there is a rapid and very fast exponential growth of resources used by data centers, especially when it comes to energy, which means that the more data centers, the energy demand will grow exponentially and will eventually become unsustainable. The second group scrutinized a little this assumption because they say that the current environmental impacts of data centers, so what we know about the problems of data centers in the current moment, first, cannot be extrapolated to the future. So the first group assumes that the problems that we have in the present, so the current consumption will be the same future consumption. And the second group says that that's not the case. You cannot apply the current state of arts of the technology for a future technology because most likely you'll gain efficiency in terms of energy consumption. Likewise, you cannot apply what happens at the local level, so your impact in the city where the data center is located to the global, because in the global level we have macro factors that do not exist at the local level, and most likely those macro factors also impact the demand, and in general they impact reducing the energy demand of data centers. So essentially the second group says that some of those exponential growth assumptions, they sometimes consider that the future state of arts would be like the present state of arts, which is very difficult to forecast. And second, that the local impact is very similar. The global impact is just kind of an extrapolation of the local impact. But they also say that's not the case because you do have macro factors at the global that do not exist at the local and very likely, in fact, affect the impact. And why is this general discussion relevant? Because they by itself there's like a background problem of constraint already in the policy making of data centers, in particular to evaluate the environmental impacts. First is the blind spot problem, which means that if you're a policymaker, which kind of study should you take into account? Should you take into account the first group of studies that say there will be a rapid exponential growth and whose conclusion is likely no longer data centers, or the second group that says it won't be that exponential, but we also don't know how the impact is going to be in the future. So it creates a sort of a problem of which kind of study has more credibility when you're a policymaker to base your policy on. The second one is the level of action and the time framing for making such policies. Because as we said, first, the level of action refers to when should you act to enact such policies. And what we see is that data center policies continue to develop. At the same time, we have growing climate problems. So when should you act? Should you enact such policies for data centers once the environmental problems of data centers are too big to handle? Should you be preventive? Or when is exactly the tipping point if the climate situation worsens at the same time that technology improves on data centers? Would one, like the benefits of technological improvement, compensate the climate impacts? That's not clear. And the same applies for the time frame. And here in the time frame, we are talking about the window of action that you can have in terms of time for making such policies. That means that, well, especially with the climate situation worsens, when should you act? If we pick the level of action time frame together, this creates a situation where you have to act quickly, and you have to act quickly in an even shorter window of chance. And that's the general background problems. Now we shall proceed to the framework under which this work will be analyzed. So we're going to evaluate four policy elements in this framework. Both of these four elements will be applied for both cases. So for Singapore and Amsterdam, and these four elements will be seen in two timeframes. So pre-moratorium and post-moratorium. That means that, for example, in Singapore, you're going to look now Singapore pre-moratorium, and then after moratorium, those four elements. So the first one is policy values. Policy values essentially refers to the prevailing policy paradigm. And then here, pre-moratorium, post-moratorium, depending on which when you're talking about. The policy targets, which very straightforwardly refers to the goals that the data center policy aimed to achieve. So which was the goal of the data center policy pre-moratorium and post-moratorium. The policy instruments that refers to general techniques and the mechanisms that governments, the authorities had at their hands to reach that policy target they established. And the fourth one, this one is more specifically to the pre-moratorium, which is the factors of change. So which are the factors that motivated this moratorium to take place? And whether first they were endogenous or exogenous, so they were internal to the data center policy dynamics or external. And well, if they really reflect what was being said by the government. So it's essentially the negative environmental impacts caused by the growth of digital infrastructure. So without further ado, let's go to the research itself. So why pick Singapore and Amsterdam? Because there are three interesting similarities among those cases, actually. First, in both cases, the moratoriums were a sudden change of policy paradigm for data center in both places. So as I said, places of attraction that suddenly they do not want it data centers anymore. They were based on the same justification. So they were based the fact that the moratoriums were said to contain the negative environmental impacts. And curiously, they were issued in a very similar time frame. So both moratoriums came in 2019. And to facilitate the evolution of the discussion, we came up with a research question. And the purpose of this research question is essentially to evaluate whether this trade-off that exists between the digital infrastructure growth, so the digitalization, and the sustainability, which is the environmental impacts, is really the factor that stimulated this moratorium, or to which extent was this decisive factor. So to simplify, you can understand that the motivation research question for this is to what extent was the moratorium, and here for each case, caused by the trade-off between digital infrastructure growth and its environmental impacts. So let's first look at Singapore. So how was Singapore pre-moratorium? So the policy value of Singapore, first, it came from colonial times in which Singapore was always being used as a communication hub throughout the whole region. That means that since colonial times, Singapore has been the first place in South Asia in particular to have communication infrastructure to function as a kind of a connection hub. What I mean by that was the first place where you put subsea cables to connect the telegraph lines. And this tradition from colonial times actually continued since today, where we see that Singapore was a pioneer in terms of putting subsea cables or financing fiber optics, for example, more contemporarily. And this has always been done to a second tradition of Singapore, which is government control. That means that the government always played a very prominent role in shaping the country's economy and deciding which kind of strategic services in particular the country should focus on based on its communication hub value throughout the region. So the country has always been very proactive in not only, how can I say, encouraging, but also fostering and planning Singapore as a communication hub in terms of financing this communication infrastructure very directly. And this is very connected naturally with the policy targets. That means that Singapore liked data centers for two reasons. The first one is that they like data centers to attract this more data-focused business, so kind of digital economy related ones. And this was seen as a way to modernize Singapore's economy, because as I said, the government always controlled the communication infrastructure. It always had a very prominent role in establishing this communication infrastructure, and it used as a leverage to attract business and then leave the new data center permits next to those hubs. And the second one is connected to a more contemporary approach, which is the smart city. Singapore has ambitions to become a smart city reference, and as such, data centers are needed background infrastructure to enable the government services, the transmission of data, the storage of data in real time. The third element, the policy instruments pre-moratorium. Singapore had three. The first one we already briefly mentioned, which is the government intervention. So the government issued the new data center permits for companies very close to its communication infrastructure. So it would put next to the subsea cables or the fiber optics owned by the government for the companies. Second one is regulatory incentives. Pre-moratorium, these regulatory incentives were very much focused on data security and data privacy. Singapore had what is called, by that time, before pre-moratorium, was the SS5C4, which was mostly focused on the pre-moratorium, on the new standards for cloud service security. It was one of the first in the world to focus on data security and privacy, which was very desirable by companies because it provided a very predictable and safe framework. And the third one is financial support for innovation, which the country always financed, in particular research and development, in particular areas that it seems very necessary, and in data centers that's in general focus on sustainable technologies. That means reduce the consumption, because as we're going to see in the moratorium now, it was a very sensitive discussion. So when is the moratorium? So it was enacted tacitly in 2019. That means that the government never officially announced the moratorium. It just stopped enacting or issuing new permits for data centers. So it was never officially announced the moratorium. It was just tacitly implemented. And what was the reason for this moratorium? And what we see is that there's a great convergence between the reasons that the government mentioned and the reasons which the moratorium took place, which is even before the moratorium, there were already a high discussion about the need to curb the energy and water use of data centers in Singapore. And in particular, because this high energy consumption and water was in particular energy, of course, was affecting the country's goals of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That means that the energy consumption was so significant that the country was struggling to meet its emission goals and reduce it. And so what was the trim? And this indicates a certain rebalance of the paradigm, which was no longer only about the communication goals of attracting the business and consolidating as a communication hub, but also considering environmental concerns and finding a more balanced way. The policy targets were essentially three. The first one is just to decrease the growth rate of data centers. The second one was to gain time. So the moratorium was used to gain some time to adapt the power infrastructure to handle this increased energy demand of data centers. So expand the energy infrastructure for data centers so that it doesn't consume that much electricity. And third one was to incorporate, naturally, very connected to the policy value, was to incorporate the new policy targets about the use of resources by data centers, which essentially meant that data centers would need to use resources more efficiently. So less energy use and less water use. And which instruments the government had to achieve those three targets? So there are three main types of instruments. The first one, naturally, is the moratorium itself, which is the suspension or approval for the new data center permits, which was never officially announced, as I said, but tacitly done. The second one is the financial support, which two main mechanisms here. They're not the only ones, but they're the more important ones, for example, which was essentially the extension of existing funding schemes for data centers to be able to make the needed reforms, the existing projects, so it doesn't apply for the new projects, but the existing projects to become more sustainable, which means that the extension of the resource efficiency grant for energy, which was mainly for energy utilities, but was expanded also for data centers. And the second one was a new investment channel, which was the investment allowance for emissions reduction, which is essentially just investment for you to invest in technologies that would reduce your emissions. So efficiency technologies, essentially. And as I said, there was the SS 564, which there was a change. If pre-moratorium, it was mostly focused on cybersecurity and data privacy, what we see is that the new reform standard also was expanded to include the new sustainability concerns. So it was relabeled as the Green Data Center Standard, which means that no longer, it's not that cybersecurity was no longer important, of course it was, but it was expanded to include also the sustainability concerns. So which was the factor of change in Singapore? That's a very straightforward answer. It was exactly what they said. So they had a growing concern about the resource consumption and the national emission goals in particular, so the climate reduced emissions. So there was a big convergence between what they said it was the problem, the measures they implemented to deal with the problem, and the post-problem. So when the moratorium was lifted, similar to how it was enacted tacitly, it was also tacitly lifted. The tacit lift happened in January 2022, when essentially the government finished the, let's say, the halt for new projects. But in terms of effectively, it was only effectively lifted in July 2022, when in fact you had the official reopening of new data center projects, what was called the DC CFA scheme, which is currently happening until November 2022. But there was, as we said, a difference. Now there was a cap on energy consumption for new projects, and in particular, this cap is 60 megawatts per year. So the new data center projects cannot extend beyond 60 megawatts. And when we observe the research question, we see that really triggered, like exactly what I said, the environmental impacts did trigger the orientation of the policy making. And there's a big coherence between the policies implemented post-moratorium and the pre-moratorium. And essentially, the moratorium served to strike a more balanced approach between digitalization and decarbonization. Now we go to Amsterdam. So pre-moratorium, it's very connected to the administrative identity of Amsterdam, which Amsterdam is actually, Netherlands was the second country in the world to have access to internet, and Amsterdam was the second place in the world outside of America to have access to internet in 1988. So historically, Amsterdam has always been a flag, an early adopter of new technology administration. And this digitalization has always been an identity of administrative and political culture since the 1990s. The region was always famous for adopting it. The policy target was also very simple, was to attract data-focused business and internet exchange services for Amsterdam area. And the policy instrument was fairly simple by that time as well. So they just they have urban planning zones. In the case of Amsterdam, the business planning zones, where they freed some business planning zones to be deployed for data centers, in particular next to the internet exchange services. And there were offered some economic incentives, in particular some flexible tax schemes for you to have like big data projects and tax exemptions on certain type of digital services to attack those business. And the moratorium for Amsterdam was a little more straightforward because it was officially announced. So it was officially announced in 12 July 2019, when the authority, environmental authority, so the alderman for environmental and sustainability from the Amsterdam metropolitan region, together with the Haarlem-Memer region, they announced it. And the moratorium was expected to last 1 year. So the construction of new data center projects was halted for 1 year. In terms of policy values, when we look at the moratorium, there was actually no change of policy values. In fact, one thing that it was stressed during the official documents is that Amsterdam desired to keep the current policy path, and that there was no desire to readjust some of the policy paradigms for the moratorium itself. The policy targets of the moratorium reached two areas. The first one is urban planning. In particular, it was said that data centers, the spatial use, so the data center facilities used a lot of the Amsterdam business zone area, and that was not desirable because the region has a shortage of land, so it was seen as consuming a lot about the geographical position, and that was creating some problems with other business who were competing for it. And the second one is energy infrastructure. In particular, one obligation that was desired for data centers, which was the reuse of residual heating from data centers to the household. So data centers should pick their heating and connect it to be transferred to also the households to spare some electricity consumption there. The policy instrument was also extremely straightforward, which was for the moratorium, which essentially the government temporarily halted, and this halt of new data centers was done by the issuing of a special preliminary planning decision, which they wanted to amend the zoning plans for business zones permits, in particular to the data centers. So this special preliminary planning decision was served to halt while the new for the halt and moratorium, while adjustment was being made. And in terms of the factors of change, we see that they're not exactly based on environmental impacts per se. We saw that it's very connected to a change of the urban planning policy power. And there was also going on a crisis, a heating crisis in the Amsterdam waste heater, which was the AB. And this launched a political crisis inside the Amsterdam administration. And this was kind of affected also the data center parts. This is discussed in more details in my discussion paper. The post-moratorium it was lifted, as I said, for 1 year, so it was lifted in July 2020. But although the Amsterdam did not change, it doesn't mean that won't be a change in the Netherlands, because from 2021 to 2022, the Dutch government, make a new data center national policy strategy, which indeed now the Dutch government is trying to readjust its whole data center policy. So it's important to understand that even though the moratorium itself had very limited applications in Amsterdam, it had broader diffusion implications of the Netherlands, in particular to the national policy. And in terms of observing the research questions, in Amsterdam, if we look at Amsterdam itself, did not trigger orientation of policy making, so the data center policy was the same. And the moratorium was a response to the exogenous factors, which involved the urban planning situation and energy infrastructure, which is better detailed in our discussion paper. But indirectly, there may be a change of data center policy made by the readjustment of the data center policy nationwide, so the Netherlands, the Dutch government reorientation. And which are the general lessons that we took there? It's first that when we handle this trade-off between digitalization and sustainability, moratoriums can be effective, so they can be effective short-term policy, but they may raise long-term implications, which you don't necessarily desire in terms of scaring away investors or changing a certain tradition. So if you need to enact a moratorium, even though to be effective in the short term, it needs to make sure that you make the best use of this opportunity to implement the changes you need, because it's not sustainable in the long term to have a moratorium. And the second one is a more general one, which we generally perceive digitalization as always desirable. So we always want more digitalization, but the moratorium show that sometimes external pressures, which are high enough, and in this case, environmental pressures, may really compel a reevaluation of your policy making, and you really need to change that. And to conclude, there was not a moratoriums themselves did not are a threshold point where they initiate a new data center policy paradigm. But Singapore did sort a more balanced approach, so it was a reevaluation of the policy paradigm. Amsterdam, so the Amsterdam itself did not change a standard change, but it did prompt a nationwide reevaluation by the Dutch government, which at the time of this presentation is still going on. And the moratorium lessons, as we just discussed, that it may be efficient in the short term, very effective to rebalance, but it does not change the policy paradigm per se. So it's better that you make good use, because it's not sustainable strategy in the long term, and that digitalization is generally good, but sometimes if you have external pressures or external negative effects, it may recompel how this process takes place. But as many of those processes going on, it's they still need like further investigation, in particular over the causes for a future research and outlook. And with that, I thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, you can look at my discussion paper or contact me directly. Thank you very much.